together, and what have you got? Bibbidi-bobbidi-boo.
Hello everyone and welcome to episode 9 of Waly Gisnep's Animated Classics. We are challenging the concept that Walt Disney put forward of animated classics, a selection of films that Disney says these are the absolute best. We are working through them in chronological order and analysing them on their own merits to put together a list of the premium films. We are calling this list Waly Gisnep's Animated Classics. My name's Ben and joining me as always is my good friend Liam. Liam, which film are we looking at today?
Well, you'll be glad to hear that we are out of the tunnel of shit known as the package films. And we're on to a film that's actually considered a classic. Today we're looking at Cinderella. Ben, before we dive into it, what were your overall impressions of Cinderella going into this?
We talked previously on this podcast about those Disney films you watched a lot when you were very young, and so you might not consciously remember them, but they're very deeply ingrained. So before this rewatch, if you'd asked me to do a blow-by-blow, I'd only be able to give you the basic Cinderella story, but watching it, every single line and piece of animation resonates deeply with me. How about you, Liam?
So this is Disney's first real princess film. I'm not including Snow White. I know he likes to, but Snow White's rubbish. So really, this is the first Disney princess film. And growing up, I had a lot of really deeply ingrained misogyny, so I kind of avoided the princess films. And it's only really in recent years that I've gone back to try and appreciate them for what they are. So this is a film that I can approach with almost no nostalgia, which I think is quite handy. Is that alright me saying? Because it's true. I grew up with deeply ingrained misogyny and I'm like, oh no, what a princess film.
It's called the patriarchy. You're very entitled to criticise it. But I think this does feed into something that I think is a strength of this film, and in a wider sense the princess films in general. All the main characters in this film are women, and this is a film that's about the relationship between female characters. You're probably familiar with the Bechdel test, which is a very minimal test for seeing how a film treats female characters, and it sets the very low standard of having two female characters who are both named and do things that aren't directly related to men. And this is a film that surpasses that substantially. You try naming me other films from the 1950s that have this focus on relationships between women, I suspect you're going to struggle.
Does it count as passing the Bechdel test if every woman in this film only talks to Cinderella in order to order her to clean and make them food?
I mean, since cleaning and making food isn't a man, I guess so? Let's get started then. 1950, Cinderella is released. Production started during the 1940s, but they couldn't push it through due to the budgetary constraints they were under, hence the release of the package films we've discussed in the last 3 episodes.
I took a leaf out of your book, Ben, and I was looking at the names in the credits this time. I couldn't find anything particularly interesting. There was a Thor, which is always nice, but I did notice that there were a lot of German names, and I'm wondering if Disney had their own version of Operation Paperclip.
That's so close to being too dark to put in a podcast. To be honest, I suspect it's probably the opposite in that a lot of people were getting out of Germany and Eastern Europe, and they probably got out during the war. The name that stood out to me was Wolfgang Reitman, who is credited in this as an animation director, and he went on to direct a lot of Disney films. He directed The Jungle Book, The Rescuers, Robin Hood, a whole bunch in the sort of 60s and 70s era. He's a very big name.
So the film starts with the classic storybook opening where we're force-fed all of the backstory as quickly as possible to just get to the actual story instead.
And for people who haven't seen Cinderella in a while, when we say classic storybook opening, we mean very literally a storybook opening. That's how the film starts.
Yeah, so the basic backstory is her mother died, her father remarried, her father died. Turns out her stepmother and her stepsisters are horrible, and now Cinderella just has to live with this.
I've seen Cinderella a bunch of times, but it's only in this most recent rewatch where I thought, is the implication that Lady Tremaine killed Cinderella's father?
I didn't pick that up, and I would wonder if she did, why she didn't also kill Cinderella, because it makes a point of saying that she is bitterly jealous of what is at the time a teenage girl. So if you're going to off your husband for the inheritance, get rid of the daughter you don't like at the same time. Or is that too suspicious?
That's our top tip, is if you're going to kill a wealthy relative, make sure you take out all the loose ends. I don't know. It's not something that I think is heavily implied, but it says the father died suddenly. There's a very dark room where it's implied he's died in, and there's Lady Tremaine stood there looking evil as hell, and I was thinking, this is very Cersei Lannister.
I don't think she can help looking evil. I think she almost certainly constantly has resting evil face. She is one of the most wicked looking characters, and also one of the most wicked sounding. I believe it's Eleanor Audley, I'll look that up at some point during this.
You're absolutely right.
Who does a fantastic job. So good, in fact, that they got her back for Maleficent.
Yeah, I realised that when I was rewatching this, and I don't know why it took me so long to realise, as she's doing the same voice for both characters.
Yeah, we've now entered this really interesting era of Disney, which I like to call the, oh, I recognise that voice era of Disney. Because it's about the same 5 actors, all doing the same performance across all of these films, and you'll just keep hearing them.
Another thing that carries over is, so for a lot of these early princess films, they would do a live action recording of a female actor, and they would then trace over that and use that as the basis of her movements and facial expressions. In this film, they use Helene Stanley for Cinderella, and they then used her again for Anita Radcliffe in 101 Dalmatians and Princess Aurora. So both Aurora and Maleficent are the same people.
I really noticed that process this time. After you mentioned it regarding the Blue Fairy, I've sort of been keeping an eye out for it, and it's really clear in this one. Because when an animator is starting from the ground up, they're in complete control, and you get the more cartoonish characters of the stepsisters, and they're very consistent. Whereas with Cinderella, you've got an artist essentially painting over live action references. And it means that some of the proportions, particularly around the face, when they're looking off at different angles, have to fit the live action model as opposed to what the artist would have in their mind. So they kind of follow very different rules to a character that you're building from the ground up.
I think it works better in this film than in Snow White or Pinocchio, because I think the art style's a little more consistent. Although the production notes do say that they didn't use any live action references with the mice, which I felt was unnecessary information. If you can't remember or haven't seen Cinderella, the mice are very anthropomorphic and they wear clothes.
Not only do they wear clothes, this isn't a universe where animals naturally wear clothes. They make a point of telling us this because when we're introduced to Gus, he's in a trap and he's completely naked, and Cinderella gives him some clothes. The problem is that we've spent the last 5 minutes establishing mice with clothes, and then we meet a new one, and it's shocking to see him naked.
It is. I couldn't put my finger on why it was weird, but as soon as you say it, you're absolutely right. And we also established that Cinderella, because she makes all the clothes for the mice, she subscribes to the same school of thought as Donald Duck in that no one needs trousers. Shoes,
shirt, hat, done. Does Donald Duck wear shoes? That would be weird.
No, he's got webbed feet, hasn't he? Why would that be weird? He's dressed as a sailor with no trousers.
I'm sure Mickey and Minnie wear shoes, because I've distinctly got high heels in my head, by which I mean Minnie wearing high heels, not just always there.
But Mickey doesn't wear a shirt. He just wears, like, shorts and suspenders and gloves and shoes. It's a whole thing. We were talking about the plot. Let's get back to that.
It's interesting that our discussion of the plot was derailed by the mice, because, oh boy, does that happen a lot during this film.
After the opening narration, we get a scene of Cinderella asleep, and she is woken up by birds and also the aforementioned mice who wear clothes. There's some other animals, we will get to them, and we get... It's not technically the first song of the film, there is a very forgettable number over the opening credits, but we get one of the more memorable songs in the film, and that is A Dream is a Wish Your Heart Makes. I'm
very happy to say as well that the singing voice has moved on. And we're no longer with that horrible, shrill 1930s, 1940s sounding. And it's a lot more palatable to the modern ear. It's pretty good, and all of the music, it's a real step up. We're back to good songs again.
I agree. I think the musical style isn't too far removed from the last 11 films we've had. It's still got that barbershop choral element to it, but I think the musicality of it is a lot stronger. And even at the time, I think it was more popular. A lot of the money they made off Cinderella was selling the soundtrack because people liked these songs so much.
I looked this up to see, and I was surprised to learn that Bibbidi Bobbidi Boo didn't win the Oscar for Best Song. Maybe it's just from an era where that didn't happen, whereas now, Disney comes out with a film, the main song will always win an Oscar. But I was genuinely surprised to see that Bibbidi Bobbidi Boo didn't win. But then I saw it lost to Nat King Cole, and I'm like, that's fine. If anything, it would have been more insulting if Nat King Cole lost an Oscar to Bibbidi Bobbidi Boo.
We'll get to Bibbidi Bobbidi Boo. And after she's been woken up, Cinderella goes about getting ready for the day. And much like Snow White, the animals are helping her out. The birds make her bed and they shower her, which is a little uncomfortable.
That scene is really satisfying. There's something about the sponge that looks very good. I realise I've just said a scene about a cartoon woman being showered is satisfying. It's the sponge. There's something about it.
I was going to talk about the sponge. It's great. Explain the sponge, Liam. Or we sound weird.
So all of the animals are helping Cinderella get ready, and one thing the birds do is they take this really nice looking natural sponge, dip it in a basin of water, which fills it up, and you see the sponge darken as it fills up. They fly it over, you can see the weight of the sponge, and they ring it over her, and it just pours water on her. And it's very typical of a lot of the tactility to the animation, and particularly the Foley. Whoever did the Foley in this film is amazing. All of the sounds sound great and they sound accurate. And they match up really well with the animation. I think overall it's just a huge step up in quality, particularly after what's been maybe 8 years of absolute rubbish.
So we've had this narration outlaying the brief plot, and then we're introduced to Cinderella, and she sings this song. The only other thought I had during A Dream Is a Wish Your Heart Makes, which I do think is a strong song, is if that's true, my heart has some weird-ass wishes. Why is my heart wishing that my old religious studies teacher would cause the apocalypse? What does it mean? And then she goes about doing normal Cinderella stuff. So she's the put-upon adopted daughter, and they treat her like scum. She has to go and get their breakfast ready, clean the house, sort the dog out, sort the cat out. She goes into each of their rooms and gets a load of grief. She goes to Lady Tremaine's room and has to get the cat Lucifer. She has this huge bed she sleeps on, and Lucifer has for a cat, very large bed as well. I guarantee you, if you bought a cat a nice big bed like that, they would never sleep in it, because cats never sleep where you want them to.
As well, talking about Lucifer, it would be remiss of me not to mention that although this is a absolutely beautiful film, the animation on Lucifer, not the best. He's got the same eyes that Scud, the dog from Toy Story, has, where they don't quite fit in the skull in any way, no matter how you try to approach it. Saying that, I do love the character of Lucifer. Out of everyone in the house that is mean to Cinderella, he's the one that is just pure evil, and he's an absolute prick to her, and I kind of love it.
You've got to give it to Lady Tremaine. She knows how to name a cat in a way that reflects its personality. And in terms of plot, there's really not much more to say about this section. We get to know Cinderella as a character. She's very sweet, and even though they treat her like dirt, she deals with it very patiently. To be honest, I don't know why. She's not under any obligation to. I guess that she would get kicked out is the implied threat, but...
Yeah, I suppose it's a case of she could either stay in this abuse or live on the streets, which probably not great for a woman during the era this is set in. That's a bit dark.
Yeah, I can see why they didn't explicitly say that, now you put it like that. This sequence ends then with Gus, the new mouse, hiding under a teacup from Lucifer the cat, and in doing that, giving one of the ugly sisters a scare, for which they obviously blame Cinderella for hiding a mouse under their teacup, and they all pile on a load of work on her as punishment. Establishing, if it wasn't clear already, that Lady Tremaine is a dick.
In recent years, we've definitely seen an era of more sympathetic or at least understandable Disney villains. And I've got to admit, it's quite nice just going back to a film where it's so simple that the character's motivation is she's just a dick. She has nothing to gain from being mean to Cinderella. She just enjoys it.
And again, not wanting to get too dark, I think in some ways, for a 1950s Disney film, there is a little bit of commentary about emotional abuse and control there. Lady Tremaine isn't a powerful or influential person. She seems to be fairly rich, although we don't see much of a comparison point in the rest of the town other than the palace, which is insane. But what she does have is power over one person, and she uses that as much as she is able to. And that can almost be a bit shocking at times.
So on the subject of the emotional abuse, I'm just going to skip ahead a little bit. Basically, the king wants a grandchild, so decides to host the ball for the prince, and every maiden in the land is invited. Cinderella assumes she will be able to go, and back to the emotional abuse. What happens with Lady Tremaine, I think, is absolutely fantastic. She tells Cinderella, of course you can go if you finish all of your work, and then proceeds to just give her an insane amount of work, encouraging both of her daughters to do the same. So they're setting up Cinderella's hopes just to be dashed, basically saying, you can go, but it's entirely on you if you don't go. And that is incredibly dark.
And I think one of the reasons Lady Tremaine has such an impact in these scenes is Cinderella is very normal. She is, quote-unquote, an everyman. And Anastasia and Drizella, the two sisters, are so animated, but in every scene, Lady Tremaine is almost motionless. The visual focus on her is always on her face and her expressions. Everything she does is very controlled and slow, and the vocal performance has that level of gravity. She is incredibly effective as a villain. I think she often gets forgotten because she's not going around killing side characters or trying to take over the world or whatever. She doesn't have any magical powers, but in some ways she's the banality of evil, and that's why she's so good.
I reckon you could make one change to this film that would make everyone remember her exactly as you say, which is have her either directly or indirectly via Lucifer kill one of the mice.
Oh, I think you're right. I sometimes forget in Princess and the Frog, spoiler warning, Facilier kills Ray, and every time he does, it's such a gut punch.
So I want that scene, but with Lady Tremaine and, say, Jacques.
Oh, Jacques! He's just gonna kill the main one. Jeez.
Not a big fan of Jacques. I find the voice really irritating. I'm not sure what they did. It's probably just pitch shifting of some kind, and they discovered that they could do it with the sound equipment they had, and they were like, this will be great, let's do it. And they do it for all of the mice, and it's really quite irritating.
I'm so glad you said that, because you were saying so many positive things about this film, and I didn't want to say I find the mice intolerable. I don't think it's just the high-pitchedness, although that's definitely a factor. It's also their speech patterns. So they do this thing where they talk in quite a basic way, and often they'll say the same word twice. So they'll say Jacques instead of Jacques. It drives me crazy.
To be fair, they are mice that have grasped the English language, so I'm giving them a bit of a free pass there. Did they ever talk to Cinderella? I think they only talk to each other, don't they?
No, they do talk to Cinderella, because Jacques tells her there's a new mouse that needs rescuing.
Oh yeah, because he tells her there's the mouse, and then she's like, oh, she's going to need a dress. And then Jack is like, no, he's a he. And she's like, oh, well, that makes a difference. I don't know, I'm going down a whole sort of like, she's enforcing gender roles on these mice.
It doesn't make a difference, they're mice. It did make me think, because I was thinking when I started watching it, do the mice talk to Cinderella? Because if not, I can see why the sisters are quite weird towards her. Because if she's just someone who lives in a tower and makes clothes for mice, I'd be like, there's something not quite right here.
Where does she get the time to make these clothes for mice? She's worked to the bone. I suppose it's just that she's a good person and nothing's going to get her down, and she's always going the extra mile for other people, and in this case, other mice.
As someone who works in the NHS, I regularly witness people who are completely worked to the bone and yet somehow manage to do it because they're good people. So it does happen. Ooh, political.
But would those people make clothes for mice?
I think it would be at least a disciplinary issue if they were. Coming back to the plot then, we skipped over the king wanting to have some grandchildren. Let's talk about the characters of the king and the duke.
The king and the duke are entirely interchangeable with the king and the duke from Sleeping Beauty, and I think they have the same motivation as well of wanting grandchildren. I was watching this and I kept waiting for a dream sequence where he's being ridden around by his two imaginary grandchildren, but then I was like, no, that's Sleeping Beauty, and then it turns out it is this, but I think it might be Sleeping Beauty as well.
Yeah, there are a lot of parallels between these two films, and Cinderella in a lot of ways feels like the trial run for Sleeping Beauty. I think one thing they do very well in these scenes with the king and the duke, the king being this blustering, frankly very unstable person who goes from one emotional extreme to the other, and the Duke being the person responsible seemingly for placating him and stopping him killing people. I think they do a great job of taking what is effectively two aristocrats in a room talking and making it a very dynamic, energetic scene when they're together.
Approaching this, I was thinking there's only really two important characters in this: Cinderella and Lady Tremaine. The stepsisters are essentially an extension of Lady Tremaine, and the prince isn't really a character. But watching it again, I was like, there is a third important character, which is the king and, by extension, the duke, who is essentially driving the plot. The prince doesn't really have a role in the plot. It's the king who sort of sets things off, and he's, as a result, has a character.
He's absolutely nuts. He's telling the Duke how he wants to hook the prince up, and the Duke sort of raises some moral and ethical issues which the king brushes aside. But he's just so weird. There's a specific bit where the Duke's kind of backing away from him down this long table because the king is advancing towards him for no adequately explained reason.
With a sword as well?
Yeah, he's just running around with a sword. No one seems to question him. So yeah, the Duke is understandably terrified, even though the king seems in a great mood. But we see later the king can turn on a dime. But the bit I really like is there's this long dining table, and the king at one point, he's lying on his stomach, facing the Duke, and he's grabbing the sides of the table with his arms and pulling himself along. And it's just like, what is this? But it's very funny. I really like it. And I like how the Duke, he has a monocle with a little chain off it, and they play with that so much. The king uses the monocle to make him look at stuff. At one point the monocle gets broken, kind of plays with it like it's a yo-yo or spins it round. Again, they do a really good job of taking a very simple physicality of a character and using it to animate them and make them visually interesting.
So the ball is set, and back at the house we've got Cinderella being worked to the bone, and Lady Tremaine knows that if she keeps her busy with work she won't have time to make her own dress. So, the mice decide to help her out and make her dress for her, singing a song in their very annoying voices whilst they do it. And I had two thoughts when this happened, which was one, the mice can sew, so why has Cinderella been making their clothes for them?
Lazy bastards.
And two, when they're making the dress, they're following the design and there's roughly shoulders. But when Cinderella later comes down the stairs wearing the dress, they no longer have the shoulders, which tells me that the mice were following the design that Cinderella wanted, but then made the creative decision to get rid of the ruffles.
I never noticed that.
It was the big thing that stood out to me was, we know you wanted this dress, but we thought the ruffly shoulders looked a bit naff. I appreciate the effort, guys, but don't be making alterations to my designs.
Like, imagine if you hired a professional tailor and said, I want you to make this. They went, I've not made that. You wouldn't be paying him.
And then imagine if that professional tailor was a group of small mice.
I don't want to go over the same ground we went over in Snow White, but I was sat there thinking, that dress is going to be covered in mouse fur.
Isn't this basically the plot of Ratatouille?
I don't remember them making a dress, but I'm going to say yes.
This sequence also has what I consider to be the best joke in the film. So the mice are sewing, and one of the mice holds up a needle, eyes up the eye of the needle, very precisely aims the thread, and then just throws her whole arm through the eye of the needle, showing that that was completely pointless. She's a mouse, of course she can get the thread through the eye of the needle.
Yeah, as much as I complain about the characterisation of the mice, I think they come with a lot of creative ways of demonstrating their world. We've talked in past episodes about how Disney films often focus either on the human world with a magical element or the animal kingdom and how it echoes our world. Cinderella is one of the rare films that has both those elements.
So Cinderella is just finishing all of her chores. Lady Tremaine and the stepsisters are ready now to leave and go to the ball, and Cinderella admits defeat and realises she's just not going to go. She's just going to go to bed instead. She goes upstairs, and we get this lovely reveal where the mice open up the wardrobe and reveal that they've made the dress for her. And we've got another wonderful joke where all the mice are saying in their very irritating voices, "It's a gift for you. Thank you for everything you've done." And Gus just says, "Happy birthday."
Even as mice go, he is exceptionally stupid.
One of the elements that you just wouldn't find today is that it's a film in which a character at several points goes, "Duh."
Well, I guess I can mention it now. There's a character in the Jungle Book that was cut. He's called Rocky the Rhino, and he's on like the extra material on the DVD, and you're like, oh, okay, a rhino. That might be interesting. And there's another version of That's What Friends Are For, which is the song the vultures sing, and he sings it with them, and he's very, that's what friends are for. And I'm like, I see why they cut this. This is intolerable. After they've made the dress then, Cinderella comes downstairs, ready to go to the ball, and the sisters are like, oh, what? Yeah, not an exact quote. And Lady Tremaine, in what I think might be one of her... I don't know, everything she does is evil. I was going to say it's one of her most evil moments.
This is one of the most horrifying moments in Disney.
That's a bold claim.
I think it is because there's no motivation. There's nothing to gain from this. She is just pure malice. And what's more, she doesn't partake. So what we're talking about here is Lady Tremaine is defeated by this idea that Cinderella can now go to the ball, but she notices some familiar elements on the gown and realises what's happened, that Cinderella has scavenged pieces from the stepsisters and made her own dress. So all she does is she points this out to the stepsisters, essentially like setting the dogs on Cinderella because they just go mad and start tearing all the pieces off the dress. Am I okay saying setting the dogs referring to these characters?
Yeah.
That's the phrase, isn't it? It's like setting the dogs on someone.
Yeah.
I just feel weird referring to the ugly stepsisters as the dogs.
Wasn't bad until you pointed it out, and now I'm very uncomfortable. I think the harshest thing is we established that there's a sash and a set of beads that the sisters threw. They've got so many clothes, they threw them away. I don't want this, it's junk. So the mice go, well, if they don't want them, we'll use them for Cinderella's dress. And then Lady Tremaine points it out and they say, hey, that's mine, I'm going to tear that back. But then they, as you say, they just start tearing at her dress, which we've established was her mum's. So that isn't the sisters. At that point, they're just like, well, while I'm here, just wanton destruction. Once again, reinforcing what we've learned from Disney films so far. Nice people are good looking, evil people are ugly.
And the whole way this scene is framed, there's lots of cuts, and it's all very dramatic and really quite upsetting.
Yeah, it reminds me of the forest scene in Snow White. It's very much those crash zooms and sudden cuts, and the background goes to just sort of an abstract black.
Except this time, Cinderella actually has something to be upset about.
Snow White's a wimp.
I do have to say, though, I quite like the dress after it's been torn.
Oh, yeah.
It's quite a nice dress. Got a single shoulder. I just look at her, I'm like, she could go to the ball in that.
Well, Cinderella certainly doesn't think she could. The sisters and Lady Tremaine go to the ball, and Cinderella, devastated, having the only good thing she's ever had in her life after her dad torn away from her, she runs into the very nice garden and starts weeping desperately, which summons her fairy godmother.
Not only summons the fairy godmother, but summons the fairy godmother underneath Cinderella. She sort of appears and Cinderella is crying in her lap, and I'm just wondering the mechanics of that. Was she crying in midair? Or has the fairy godmother materialised within the bench?
Yeah, it's a little quirk of animation, isn't it? But yeah, that's a good point. I think one reason the fairy godmother works really well in this film is they pushed for her to be a bit more motherly almost. She doesn't have that ethereal quality of the blue fairy, which originally was what Walt Disney was pushing for, but she's just a lot more homely, and it just makes her a lot more memorable, I think.
Yeah, and we've got, again, another really good voice performance, this time by Verna Felton, who has shown up before in Dumbo as both Mrs. Jumbo and I believe the matriarch. And she's going to show up throughout the next era of Disney, and she always does a great performance, but it's a really appropriate voice and performance for the fairy godmother, where instantly you like her. I mean, she is in contrast to the only other characters we've seen other than Cinderella who are horrible and malicious.
Yeah, they're either objectively evil or talk in a way that is unbearable, or both in the case of the sisters. And of course, this leads into probably the most famous song from Cinderella, probably the most famous moment other than the glass slipper. That is Bibbidi Bobbidi Boo.
Yeah, I absolutely love Bibbidi Bobbidi Boo. It's up there with the songs from Dumbo as just being absolute classic.
I've only got a couple of notes on it, really. One is, writing lyrics is really hard, because it's just nonsense.
This is pre-Sherman Brothers by quite a bit, at least 10 years or so, I think. But it's nice to see that Disney were doing essentially a nonsense song before the Sherman brothers arrived.
Yeah, there's a few people attributed to doing the music and songs in this film. One of them is Al Hoffman, who I was reading what he'd done. He wrote Close to You by Frank Sinatra, Papa Loves Mambo, and loads of other stuff. I was like, oh, this is a really famous songwriter. And obviously during the sequence we get the transformations. So she turns a pumpkin into a carriage, 4 mice into 4 horses. And then what I find the weirdest, she turns the horse and the dog into humans. I don't know why I find that weirder than everything else. It's just creepy.
What's weirder to me is that we've already established that the mice comprehend and can speak English, and we've had no indication of this regarding the horse and the dog. So really it would have made more sense to turn the mice into people. Instead, we've just got a footman and a coachman who presumably have no understanding of language and communication.
I would love to see just a couple of minutes of when Cinderella's at the ball, the coachman and the footman with the other members of staff just hanging around by the coaches. I don't need anything to happen, I just want to see it.
And alongside the coach, we've got probably the most famous shot in the film, which is the dress transformation.
We do, and this is going to be Ben's top trivia for Cinderella, and that is, Walt Disney said this is his favourite piece of animation from any Disney film, is the single shot when Cinderella kind of raises her arms up in an arc and her dress transforms into the beautiful ball gown. He didn't want pink elephants or, the aforementioned sponge that we talked about. This was the one he liked best.
It's a really nice sequence, and I think, as I say, when people think of Cinderella, the image that comes to mind is that dress transformation sequence where there's all the swirls and the sparkles, and I can't imagine the work and the amount of frames that went into that, because there is a lot going on, and it's constantly moving.
It's what I call the money shot for this film. In The Little Mermaid, it's when Ariel sings the reprise of Part of Your World, and she's on the rock and the wave crashes up. And in The Lion King, the money shot is Rafiki holding Simba up on Pride Rock and all the animals kicking off. I think in Cinderella, this is the money shot.
So thanks to the help of the fairy godmother, Cinderella arrives at the ball. And the only way I can really think to describe the ball is the most humiliating version of Tinder. Where one by one, every woman in the kingdom approaches the prince, they bow, and then the prince looks up to his dad and just gives him this annoyed look on his face, and the woman walks away. I'm presuming this just happens all night, because it's happening until Cinderella arrives. And then from that point, he's just like, well, I'm just going to go off with this one instead.
What's the point of being at the ball once he's clearly not interested in you? You just stand around going, this is a bit rubbish.
There's not even any other men to dance with. They only invited the women.
As you say then, he sees Cinderella, who's just amazed at the palace. And to be fair, I'm pretty amazed by the palace. I think it's definitely the best Disney palace. And we've not talked a huge amount about this, but I think the backgrounds and the art design in this film is phenomenal. I think there's a lot of inspiration from German expressionist cinema. There's a lot of very tall and dramatic angles. There's a lot of use of shadow and very stark architecture, or starchitecture, if you will. I don't know if you've ever seen anything like The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari or anything like that, but this film really reminds me of that. And I think the palace is the crowning achievement of these sweeping vistas that they've painted.
It's strange that you say that, because the one thing that the palace did remind me of all things, was M. Though I do think it's weird that Cinderella's palace has gone on to become the symbol for Disney, but it's not, because the palace they use in all of the media and at the theme parks, that's not the palace in this film. I'm not sure where the palace for the theme parks comes from, but they call it Cinderella's castle, but it's a completely different castle.
From what I can tell, the one they use at the theme parks is a mashup of Cinderella's and Aurora's castles, once again proving that they can't be bothered to distinguish between the two.
So Cinderella dances with the prince, they go off and wander the gardens, and they just spend the evening getting to know each other. And then suddenly she realises that the clock's about to strike midnight, at which point all of the magic that the fairy godmother has cast will be broken.
Well, you say it's about to turn midnight. She is with the prince, and the clock starts chiming, and she says, "Oh, it's midnight, I've got to go." And he's like, no, don't go. And obviously she rushes off and leaves the glass slipper. And we hear the clock chiming, and Cinderella gets in her coach and rushes off, and the Duke's like, close the gate, send some dudes after her, whatever. And she's pretty much home when the magic finally wears off, which is the last beat of the clock, which suggests she gets from being with the prince to almost being home in 12 seconds.
When watching it, I was really hoping that she got to the front of the palace and was just greeted by a pumpkin and a dog.
This isn't how I left it.
On the subject of the slipper, one thing I only noticed this time watching is that they set that up really well. Early on in the film, I think the first time Cinderella is climbing upstairs, she loses her shoe.
I have never noticed that, and you're absolutely right. That's good. Good filmmaking, 1940s/50s Disney.
So what they've established is that one of Cinderella's feet is a little bit smaller, and as a result, the shoes don't fit properly, which kind of contradicts the whole ending of this film.
Well, they're slippers, right? They slip on, they slip off. I mean, they're not slippers. Slippers are what you wear to bed. These are very clearly high heels.
So Cinderella manages to get home, and throughout all of this, she hasn't realised that the person she was speaking to was the prince. She just met a man and had a lovely evening and has sort of fallen for him. I'm not sure how she didn't realise it was the prince. He was the only man at the ball.
Well, the Duke and the King were there. Maybe she thought it was one of them.
I assume the prince is that man next to the king with a monocle.
We then get a second scene of the Duke and the King. The King's very happy because the Prince has met someone who he clearly loves. The Duke has to explain they've lost her and all they've got is the glass slipper. The King then sends the Duke out to try the glass slipper on all the women of the land. It shouldn't take him that long. The palace is about as big as the village. So the Duke goes out and starts doing that.
They also manage to establish and poke fun at how ridiculous this is, because the king says, you need to find this woman, go out there and try that slipper on every woman if you have to. And the Grand Duke says, this slipper could fit any number of women. And the king just responds with, well, that's his problem.
Yeah, I really like that. It preempts people calling out saying, well, what's so special about Cinderella? They kind of say nothing. Although it still does end up fitting Cinderella, so there you go. I also like that this scene uses I'm going to say it's Disney's equivalent of the Wilhelm scream. I'm going to play it now. That one.
I've noticed this in a couple of the package films leading up to this, but I think this might be the first proper film to feature the goofy scream. So the Grand Duke goes around the kingdom trying the slipper on all the women. We've got a bit of hilarity where he finally gets to the stepsisters and their feet are too big because big feet are ugly and good people have small dainty feet. I assume that's what Disney's going for here. And again, in another wonderful moment from Lady Tremaine, she figures it all out and just locks Cinderella in her attic, which does lead to one of the weirdest climaxes in any film. If you thought the time of the clock striking midnight was stretched, the climax of this film involves two mice stealing a key from a pocket and climbing flights of stairs up to the attic, all in the time it takes two women to try on a glass slipper.
They get around it a little bit by saying the Duke's tired because he's been up all night and he falls asleep and Lady Tremaine doesn't want to disturb him and the ugly sisters are trying to force the shoe on while he's asleep. But yeah, it's a bit of a stretch.
And it doesn't end. The mice finally get to the top of the stairs and oh no, Lucifer is there and is trying to stop them.
Lucifer the cat.
The mice... No, the devil himself. So pleased with the malice of Lady Tremaine, has been like, you know what, I'm going to help her out. This is fun. So Lucifer catches the mice, so they have to call the dog upstairs, who runs upstairs, chases the cat away, finally letting Cinderella get the key.
Now, the dog chases Lucifer the cat out of the window, and the last we see of Lucifer is him falling out of the attic window. I can only assume Lucifer dies there. Eat your heart out, Mufasa.
No, because a cat always lands on its feet, unless that cat is Mufasa.
It doesn't matter if it lands on its feet, if it's falling hundreds of meters. It can land on its feet and then its feet are going to go through its shoulders.
It's just a very weird and drawn out climax. The stakes feel far higher than they are. What is it said? It's just a key, bringing a key upstairs. Though, for all that, it does lead to one of the nicest moments in a Disney film, which is Cinderella comes downstairs. The Duke is like, oh, I thought you said there was no more women. We'll try the slipper on this one. And determined not to let Cinderella have any happiness, as the Duke is walking, Lady Tremaine trips him up, sending the slipper flying, and it completely smashes. At which point Cinderella just goes, oh, it's all right, I've got the other one. And it's just this lovely moment, and the look of just pure annoyance on Lady Tremaine's face is amazing.
Yeah, it's a perfect ending to the film. I like that Lady Tremaine, knowing the king and the duke, when she trips the footman up, she's basically condemned the duke to death. She's willing to do that just to make Cinderella unhappy. The last thing we get then is Cinderella and the prince are married, they live happily ever after, and we get something I'm always a sucker for in a Disney film.
Is it mice in little wedding outfits?
No, it's not. It's the choral swell at the end where they do a reprise of the main theme of the film. I don't know why, it gets to me every time. I love when they bring it back in The Little Mermaid. It always makes me happy.
And that's Cinderella. It's a really solid fairy tale.
Of course, Disney are never ones to sit on their laurels, or rather, to sit on a successful film when they could make more money from it. As such, we got a live-action remake of Cinderella. Liam, tell us what you think about it.
So I avoided this at the time because, as I say, I never really grew up with Cinderella, and at the time when this came out, it's not a film I was particularly bothered by, so I thought, well, if it's just a shot-for-shot remake, there's not much I can really get from it. So I watched the remake in preparation for this, and I kind of wish I hadn't, because it almost ruins my enjoyment of the original because it is so much better.
Oh, really?
I was genuinely surprised by this, but almost every creative decision they make is for the better of the film. It's a far more fleshed out film. First of all, I will admit I'm probably incredibly biased because both Lily James and Richard Madden might be the two most beautiful, charming people in the world. But the remake is more of a love story, and all of the changes made to accommodate this better serve the plot. When I now look at the original, it's more about Cinderella escaping abuse, and as a result, the prince is just a means for her to do that. In the remake, just by chance, Cinderella and the prince meet in the woods one day, and there's just this spark between them. Again, performances are great, and you just buy it. And from that moment, you are rooting, even though you know, obviously, they're going to end up together, because they have met very early on, neither of them knows who the other is, but they just click. You're just rooting for them to meet. So it's then the prince's decision to host the ball, because he's like, I don't know who this woman is, let's invite every woman in the kingdom, just for the hope that she might walk through the door. Meanwhile, his dad's trying to marry him off to more royalty. She, on the other hand, hears about the ball and is like, maybe that man I met would be there. I've got to go just for the chance to meet him again. When she obviously gets there, she realises he's the prince, so they do away with the whole not realising he's the prince, which is nice in the original. It's nice that all she really wants to do is go to the ball, whereas in this, her motivation is to meet the man that she's sort of fallen for. There's all these subtle yet really nice creative changes. Number one being, Kenneth Branagh, the director, doesn't really know what to do with the mice, so he all but cuts them.
I guess since he couldn't play one of the mice, he wasn't interested.
I think as well, it's partly because they are CG and he's not a director who's very comfortable with CG. The chase scene where she's leaving the ball, they turn it into a bit of an action scene, doesn't look great, takes me out of the film, but as I say, almost all of the creative decisions are for the better. One that really stood out is the footman in the remake is changed from a lizard, and they hadn't really established these lizards before, but the fairy godmother just has a lizard, and I'm like, that's a weird thing to see in some Central European country, this bright green lizard, that's a weird thing to see. And on that note, in the transformation scene, they go for some proper David Cronenberg body horror. When everyone has been turned into a person, they still resemble the animal they were changed from. Like, it's not a complete transformation, and they look weird. And there is a moment where the lizard footman catches a bug with his tongue, and I was like, oh, so that's where they wanted to be a lizard. And then I was like, wait a minute, no, that's amphibians, not lizards. And then to make it worse, I looked up the original story, and the footman in the original story was changed from a frog. Just use a frog!
Liam, you say they made a lot of changes to improve it. I'm going to ask the question we're all thinking. Does Lady Tremaine kill a mouse in it?
She doesn't. However, she's played by Cate Blanchett, who is one of those actresses who never disappoints me. She always knows exactly the tone of the film she is in, whether it's completely straight and dramatic or, as is here, she just chews as much scenery as she can get her teeth on, I suppose is the phrase. And she's simultaneously more sympathetic with a bit more background and motivation, but also just more completely malicious. And her resolution, there's a really good scene they add, which is absolutely wonderful, where she figures it all out. She figures out what's happened at the ball. So she goes to Cinderella and is like, I admit it, I've been defeated. I wanted my life to go a certain way. Despite all of my efforts, it's not happening. I thought I could marry my daughters off. That's not going to happen. I will give you your happy ending if you take me with you, essentially. She basically says, I will help you be introduced to the court so you can marry the prince, but you have to make me head of the household when you're married. And she's like, no, you've been nothing but mean to me, and I'm not going to let you do that to the prince. Cinderella martyrs herself. She's like, I'll suffer your abuse, but I'm not inflicting your abuse on other people. It's wonderful. And this whole idea that she's like, fine, I get it. I'm not getting my happy ending. You can have yours on my terms. Cate Blanchett is probably the highlight of the film, and for that alone, I can recommend it. But the weird thing is having watched it, I find myself thinking, if I'm ever given the choice between the original and the live action remake, I'm almost always going to choose the live action remake. Obviously, if someone says to me, hey, do you want to watch the animated Cinderella? I'm going to say yes. But if someone gives me the choice of the two, I'm probably going to choose the live action.
But Liam, live action version aside, I feel there's something we've missed with the original animated version.
I suppose before we can decide whether or not this makes the list of Waly Gisnep's animated classics, we first have to decide which is the sexiest character in Cinderella. And as always, we're talking about unnecessarily animated in a sexual way, not personal preference. Though again, sometimes it's going to come into it. So Ben, who is the sexiest character in Cinderella, and why is it Cinderella immediately after she's had her dress torn?
Liam, you know me too well. Yeah, I mean, it's obviously Cinderella. We've established all the other characters are drawn as caricatures and grotesques, the only other exception being the prince. He's so bland. I'm desperate for when we get to Prince Eric and they actually do something and have a personality. The only other one with any kind of energy, I guess, is the pumpkin, but that is, at the end of the day, a pumpkin.
No, I have to agree. It's hands down Cinderella. Again, you've got that weird live action reference where this is an animated character with actual proportions. And again, I don't know why. I just like the torn dress. Bit weird that it's at her lowest point, but I'm going to go for it. Not sure what that says about me, but that's my choice.
Moving swiftly on, we need to ascertain whether the 1950 animated Cinderella film is worthy of going on the list of Waly Gisnep's animated classics. So far, we only have 2 films on there. We have the stalwarts of Pinocchio and Dumbo. Liam.
Now, this is potentially our first princess film going on the list, so I've got the ceremonial sparkly pen ready. We've rolled out the parchment. Ben, does Cinderella make it onto Waly Gisnep's animated classics?
I've spent this whole podcast generally saying positive things about Cinderella, but this may be controversial. In a world where Sleeping Beauty exists, I find it hard to put Cinderella on there because everything Cinderella does, Sleeping Beauty does a little bit better, or in some cases a lot better. We didn't put Bambi on the basis that The Lion King does the same kind of thing but a lot better, and for that reason, for me, it's a no.
Now, going into this, I was ready to put this on. I think before I watched it again, I thought it's going to be a no-brainer, this is going on. However, as I say, having watched the live-action remake, which as you say, it does everything but better, if I'm always going to recommend people watch the live-action remake instead, does that mean the original is in some way flawed in its inferiority? However, I do still really like Cinderella, and for the benefit of throwing it out to the audience, I'm going to say I want to put it on the list. So that puts us at an impasse, which means we're handing over to you. So, what do you think? Does Cinderella deserve a place on Waly Gisnep's animated classics? You let us know. I have got the big sparkly pen ready and waiting.
In the meantime, feel free to argue with us in the comments about things we have or haven't said, and we are going to be looking at the next animated classic next week. Liam, what film is that?
Next up is going to be the 1951 film Alice in Wonderland, one of the odder entries to Walt Disney's animated classics.
So that's everything from me and Liam, and we will see you then.